Hey guys, how's it going? This is Natnator. Welcome back to your weekly dose of Creepypasta. We're back with the second and final part of In-cide. Great story all round. I really enjoyed visualizing this strange occurrence. You know the title, so as always, turn out the lights, get comfortable, and let the story begin. The brothers found themselves screaming back at him in unison and repeating nearly identical phrases like, "It's a trap, get us out, and get help." And for a moment, they thought they'd gotten through to him. It appeared for a moment that he was calling others over in an effort to help them. Unfortunately, the view through the dim green wall didn't provide enough detail for them to see the skeptical expression on Uncle Frank's face. And then, the faces of those that joined him. It was the smell. It was just too powerful. Mikey should have known from his own interactions with Gary when he first encountered him in the dome. He hadn't believed his brother when he was told that there was no food, just as those on the other side of the dome's wall did not believe him. They knew with the same certainty that he had that either A, they were just too stupid to locate the food, or B, they were trying to keep it all for themselves. That scent, unfortunately, proved to be as strong as any drug in Porch, and the small crowd gathering on the outside of the dome seemed to be leaning toward the latter. Before too long, they weren't trying to communicate with the brothers any longer, and began to split up into small front door search parties. Gary and Mikey watched with morbid fascination as the crowd grew larger and larger, all searching for a way in. They covered every inch on the dome's walls, and even onto its roof, and the brothers desperately tried to keep as many of them in their viewpoints as possible. While these stupid fools may have been trying to get in, instead of getting them out, it could still work in their favor. If someone were to manage their way in, and one of them could see them do it, then they'd know how to get out, theoretically. The key element to their continued existence was finding that damn door, and every neuron they had was singularly focused on that task. The steadily growing assembly outside could only be a good thing as far as they were concerned. They'd already exhausted their hopes of finding the door themselves from the inside. This could very well be their last, best chance at escape. Occasionally, they would catch a snippet as one group would call out to another, "Not here," or "Keep looking." But for the most part, they were nothing more than obscured shapes, scaling about the dome, creating strange green shadows that danced eerily across the floor and inner walls. If the brothers hadn't been so intensely fixated on keeping up with their progress, the effect would have been nothing short of creepy. Every second was a minute, and every minute an hour, to the extent that time almost had no meaning. Days could have passed when a random voice rang out with a pitch-perfect clarity that could have come from right next to them. "It's here." They had no idea whose voice it was, although it did seem somewhat familiar. Surely, someone they'd both met before. "I found the door, everyone!" she screamed again. "I found the door!" They didn't see anyone's bright eyes looking back at them from any direction, and they immediately separated, desperately searching for the source. Normally, Gary wouldn't have let Mikey set off in the opposite direction, such as he did, but they both knew in their cores that this was a crucial moment, one they couldn't let pass them by. Somewhere close, someone had found their way out. "Where are you?" Gary called out to the voice, no longer able to see his brother or the new occupant. "Help us!" "I'm right here, dear." Gary spun on his heels, and there she was, standing right in front of him. It was Mary something or other. Gary had met her on a couple of occasions. At his age, politics wasn't really something he kept up with, but he kind of thought that she was the mayor or maybe a preacher. He was pretty sure he'd seen her speaking before crowds of some type, but it was hard to say in his current traumatized state. Whatever the case, seeing her standing here in front of him was the last thing he wanted to see. "No!" he screamed involuntarily. "No, no, no! Where's the door? How did you get in here?" He could tell from Mary's mildly bemused facial expression that she was giving no credence to his panic. For starters, he did have something of a reputation in Porch for his emotional escapades, so most adults generally gazed at him with that same look. Beyond that, however, was the fact that she was fully enraptured by the aroma still wafting off the walls. He could see it in her eyes. She held no concern for his safety. "It's right there behind me, silly," she said, as she flitted past him in search of the elusive food. Gary could feel the tears pooling again as he desperately searched the area from which she'd came, the direction from which he had just come. Much as he expected, there was nothing there. It was as maddening as it was frightening. After a couple frantic minutes, searching walls he'd already searched a dozen times before, Gary decided to backtrack and grill Mayor Mary a little harder about the way she'd gotten in. It was a moot decision, however, as the moment he spun around, he was met by Uncle Frank and several of his drinking buddies who filled the hole before him, appearing as if from nowhere. "Uncle Frank!" Gary screamed, the joy he suddenly felt piercing his tone. Uncle Frank's manic friends immediately dispersed in both directions, making no effort to conceal their drooling, zombified expressions. Much like Mary before them, they were fully caught up in the hypnotic aroma's smell. "How?" was all Gary managed to get out before his uncle was cutting him off while physically covering the young's mouth to hush him. "Not now, Little Buzzy." Little Buzzy was his go-to pet name for any local child whose real name didn't instantly spring to mind. Gary knew that Uncle Frank knew his name, but much like the others, he wasn't engaging in the type of rational thought he normally would be. It was more than evident from his wide, wild eyes. It surely didn't help that he'd probably spent the better part of the morning getting drunk on the locally produced fermented apple concoction that served as the biggest tourism draw in the summers. "Just point me in the direction of the food, kiddo." It was a reaction beyond anything that Gary could easily digest, and something inside him just kinda snapped. Without even knowing that he was going to do so, Gary watched in slow motion as his arm autonomously raised itself and swung through the air, smacking Uncle Frank right across his face. For a full 3 seconds, there was nothing but shocked silence, as neither of them could actually believe it had just happened. "What the f—" the older of the two began, but Gary cut him off. "The door, Frank. Where's the damn door?" The simple fact that Gary hadn't addressed him with the normal uncle attached to his moniker seemed to convey his seriousness more than anything, and Uncle Frank's jaw dropped open. He blinked several times, as if waking up from a dream, before finally sputtering, It's right there." He pointed to a spot in the wall where he thought he had just entered, but, much to his chagrin, there was nothing there save the sheen solidity of impenetrable green. Uncle Frank blinked again and shook his head as he struggled to process just exactly what was happening. For a moment, Gary thought he'd won his uncle over to his side of genuine concern. That was, up to the point that Uncle Frank's belly gurgled its insistence, easily redirecting his attention. "Doesn't matter, kid." He waved it off. "We'll find it later. If you're not going to help me find the food, well, don't expect me to share." On the last couple words, Uncle Frank had spun around and begun to make his way in the opposite direction. Gary wanted to scream in frustration, but as it turned out, it was a good thing he didn't. As Uncle Frank had rounded the bend, just out of sight, Gary could hear him repeat, excuse me," as other voices returned with several "pardon me" coming through, and "where's the food, buddy?" There were more coming in. Gary sprinted up the bend and was met with a small crowd, maybe 20 or 30 more, and the group was continuing to grow. He desperately tried to fight his way forward through the growing mass of bodies, but his progress was becoming slower. No matter how hard he tried to jockey for any type of vantage point, he was unable to see where they were coming from. They were just coming. It was only a matter of minutes for the 30 to become 100 or more, and he found himself being pressed backwards by the overwhelming size of the group. Once he'd been pushed to a point where the bodies were coming in from both sides of the large circular hall, Gary began screaming out for his brother. It felt like screaming into the wind, however. Hundreds of voices, all asking each other some variation of the question, "Where's the food?" created cacophonous jumble of noise. He was actually shocked when Mikey came fighting his way through the crowd to his side, where the two of them embraced tightly. "Told you I'd come back, little bro." Gary's moist eyes looked up at his brother, and he nodded, as though he'd never had a doubt. In truth, he hadn't. Mikey had never let him down before. "I couldn't see where they were coming in at," Gary called out to his brother, the growing din about them making it necessary to raise their voices, even though they were right next to one another. "I know," Mikey replied. "I couldn't either. They just started flooding in." Looking around, the brothers could see that very nearly everyone in Porch seemed to be cramming themselves into the dome that had once given the impression of being very large around them. it was progressively seeming smaller and smaller as they began to be squished together from all sides. Logic appeared to dictate that once the place filled up, whomever was the last one in would be standing next to the door, and therefore would be able to lead everyone out. Regrettably, that did not appear to be the case. Instead of reaching an apex of fullness and then receding like the wading shore, the count just continued to grow, and before they were even aware of their legs leaving the ground, they were being lifted up by a sea of Portians. Fear now gripped both brothers equally as they struggled to keep their arms linked together, and somewhere in both their minds there was this idea that if they could just hold out long enough, this entire nightmare would come to an end somehow. Unless they had all just died and gone to hell, this was an unthinkable scenario that must surely give way to probability and logic at some point, and mercifully ease itself into something that could be overcome. This must have been the prevailing mindset for the group as a whole, as once they'd become crammed together, no one concerned themselves with the food any longer. They hadn't, however, given way to complete pandemonium either. There was plenty of tension and anxiety, undoubtedly, but it didn't go much further than that, at first. That was, as they would all soon discover, the calm before the storm. 15 minutes and 50 bodies later, and it was an entirely different picture. The calm that kept the tightness of their bodies from becoming a hazard dissipated. Slowly at first, and regressed the normally peaceful population into a state of primal chaos. The shifting and twisting was subtle at first, nothing more than tiny efforts for the smallest bits of comfort, but quickly and without warning, it turned into an aggressive battle for survival. Friends, neighbors, and loved ones began to flail and struggle against one another amid the growing roar of cries and moans. Showing no concern for whom they might be climbing over, it seemed most everyone had become fixated on a singular goal: not being on the bottom. Squished tightly against Mikey and struggling for breath, Gary was terrified beyond the point of making any of his own sounds, and, upon seeing his countenance mirrored in his brother's face, slipped into a self-defensive state of mental separation, looking around with wide, glassy eyes, and now detached from the reality of their predicament. His field of vision was completely filled with a massive array of wailing faces. Some of them he knew, some he didn't, but all of them shared the same panicked expressions. Somewhere deep inside, Gary was grateful for the fact that this nightmare glimpse into hell wasn't actually happening to him. Somehow, and inexplicably, the dome continued to fill, and as the crest began to rise, the degrees of primitive savagery grew with it. Churning like a slowly boiling cauldron, the roiling sea of bodies created unusual riptides, and Mikey could feel himself and Gary being pulled beneath the surface. One look into his little brother's eyes told him that the kid was no longer with him, not in any useful capacity at least. And although he knew it would make keeping them alive that much harder, he was glad to see it. Hell, he might have even been a little jealous. Either way, he wasn't going to let them get pulled into the abyss without a fight. With one arm wrapped tightly around Gary's neck, Mikey used his other appendages to try to fight his way back to the top. Mikey was a strong guy, and a good swimmer to boot, but this wasn't anything like treading water. Perhaps if the water punched him in the face and grabbed at his legs with each stroke, there might have been some ground for comparison. Gary's body felt like dead weight, and for several indeterminably long seconds, there was nothing but the painful and exhausting struggle to maintain their ground and stay afloat, along with the horrifying knowledge that the amount of time his body allowed him to continue to fight was quickly coming to an end. Gary's eyes slowly circled back to his own, as only their heads were left protruding above the fray, and Mikey thought he saw something in them that he knew would definitely not be in his own. Acceptance. There was an unfathomable peace deep within them, and Mikey couldn't help but to be amazed by the little guy, at least one more time in their lives. Gary always told anyone that would listen that his big brother was his hero, and that he would always save the day, but the truth of the matter was actually the opposite. Gary was really the hero. He always had been. The way the kid looked at the world and everyone in it was to truly be admired. Somehow, he always managed to see the beauty in everyone and everything, and even this was no exception. Mikey opened his mouth to scream, "I love you, Gary," at least one more time, even though he already knew, but the words didn't get a chance to produce themselves. As quickly as the frenetic swirling had begun, it came suddenly to a stop, followed very closely by a wave of 4 repeated words. Like an echo that grew louder as it progressed, Mikey found himself repeating the phrase as well, involuntarily sending the message forward. He can read it. It wasn't a lot to go on, but each set of ears that heard the words seemed to instantly comprehend their meaning, and, more importantly, became still as a result. The mysterious and surreal circumstances that the citizens of Porch had found themselves in was unimaginable by any stretch of the imagination, and came with no shortage of prevailing questions. Initially, what seemed to have been the most important, "Where is the food?" was nothing more than an afterthought, having quickly been replaced by more pressing ones. "Where's the door?" and "Oh dear Lord, what have I done?" There was one mystery, however, that taunted all of them in their various states of dismay, one that quite literally hung over them. Those damned words on the wall. While it didn't appear to bear any relevance to their current predicament, it still felt important. There were no avenues of logic that led anyone to believe that knowing what those huge letters spelled out would in any way improve their situation, and yet there was something about them that seemed to extend some small sliver of hope to every one of them that saw them. Somehow, in some way, those words were the key to their freedom. The effect was, in all probability, an unintended one, but that didn't stop the irrational thought from spreading quickly. So much so that the mere idea that there was someone in there who could actually read them was enough to bring about a temporarily stoic silence. From somewhere further down the bend, Mikey could see a body that had been lifted up out of the tightly wound mass and was slowly being moved forward by hundreds of hands which, at least momentarily, were working together. From his awkward, half-buried angle, it was difficult to tell who it was, only that they were old. For the most part, however, the brothers were directly beneath the 3 words on the wall, and in another moment or two, that individual would be upon them anyway. Assuming the undulating thing that they had all become together continued to maintain a cooperative calm, rather than reverting back to the previously chaotic state. The beast that was the thing in the dome contained the cumulative qualities that could make it a powerful asset if they could only keep their wits. One that could even perhaps find its way across the river Styx and out of this green Hades. Unfortunately, the thing held just as much potential for autosarcophagi. Once Mikey was finally able to see who it was that had been surfed their way, his initial response was one of genuine shock, and then a second wave of shock at the fact that, given where they were and what was happening, he could even be shocked in the first place. No one, even their long-dead mother herself, should have really been a surprise in that moment. They were, after all, in some sort of altered reality, where the normal rules no longer applied, and yet, seeing the Colonel was not at all what he'd been expecting. For starters, it was common knowledge that old Colonel Foster never left his home. Never. He was by far and away the oldest citizen of Porch, and, given that he lived right on the outskirts, could barely be called that. Something of a modern-day legend. There were so many stories told about him in town. It was all but impossible to discern truth from fiction anymore. The few things that did seem etched in stone were that old Colonel Foster was a former soldier who fought in the Great Wasp War, and who now lived as a hermit. From there, one was free to believe any number of options that had been floated over time. Everything from his being the godfather of an underground criminal syndicate, to an undead vampire, to a witness protection program candidate who'd gone into hiding after helping to bring down an underground criminal syndicate. There was no shortage of backgrounds and abilities to choose from, but as the old guy was being gently settled right next to them, Mikey remembered one in particular that came up from time to time. Old Colonel Foster could actually read. A wave of intense shushing rapidly made its way around the dome, and then all eyes were on the aged veteran, who had focused his attention solely on the 3 words before him. The first word, written above the other 2, was longer than both of the others combined, and the old guy took over a minute trying to sound it out aloud, pausing a couple of times to apologize and say, "It's been a long time since I've read." Disposa. Bull. before finally, "Disposable." Confused looks were exchanged all around, and several could be heard muttering, "Disposable?" to themselves or others, before the Colonel was pressed to continue. The next two words came easily, and were quickly spread around the dome like lightning, which fried the sanity of each that heard and then repeated them. There was a long moment of silent stillness, as each individual took the time they needed to process just exactly where it was that they were before giving in fully to the panic and fear. Mikey could only watch as his little brother was torn away from him, taking his arm with him. The gaping wound felt vaguely like ice, but given that the action sent him into shock, it wasn't nearly as intense as he thought it probably should have been. Reaching out with his remaining arm, he took one last swipe at his brother, and missed. Just before Gary disappeared into the frantically swirling sea of wailing fear, their eyes made contact for the last time, and Gary smiled at him. It was exactly what Mikey needed to see, and amazingly enough, completely washed away his distress, and he felt the peace as well. Even in the end, the kid was his friggin' hero. Then he was gone, swept away by the gory tide. Mikey looked up at the words on the wall above him, as he felt himself being pulled under as well, and couldn't help but think to himself, what creature would even conceive such a place as this? What demon from the abyss came forward to construct this green hell, otherwise known as the disposable fly trap? There was very little time to ponder the idea, however, as Mikey could feel the same freezing sensation on his back as both his wings were ripped away. Awash in arms, legs, wings, and heads, death was all about him, and he could feel its cold embrace all over. It wouldn't be much longer now, and, thanks to Gary, he was okay with that. His only real regret, here at the end of his short life, was that there was nothing he could do to keep his brethren away from this place. There was no telling how many lives this place could claim before the monsters deemed it disposable.